Catch up on all the live shows right here on AfricaTechRadio.com.
Space science and technology is no longer just what countries get involved in to satisfy their curiosity. It has become important in ensuring the survival of humanity. The vulnerability of Africa to the impact of climate change, which results in natural disasters and environmental degradation, accelerates hardship and poverty for millions of Africans. However, Africa still lacks the necessary scientific and technical capacity to assess fully and to monitor the possible future impacts of climate change. One of the instruments available to addressing the challenges of environmental monitoring and to provide early warnings of natural and human-made disasters for Africa's development is Earth observation satellites, and this is a key component of space science and technology. Africa's regional coordinator of the Space Generation Advisory Council, Tensae Ali, shares his thoughts in this episode on how important space science and technology is in Africa and to Africa.
So let's start with what space science and technology mean, and so what qualifies as space science and space technology.
First off, thank you so much for inviting me. And coming back to your question, I would basically say it's a very, very broad science and technology and engineering and a lot of things. And when we say space science and technology, though it sounds like space science and technology, in general, we usually refer it as to the space sector. And this sector basically comprises almost all disciplines we would consider as disciplines in this whole world. So whatever science that involves studies within the upper atmosphere or something related into some celestial objects, some engineering technologies, innovations, and all of that related to how objects or human can go out of this world is considered to be space science and technology. But I would like to say that when people usually say space science and technology, they actually usually refer to the space sector in general. And when we say that, I literally mean it literally comprises almost all this. It's not just space scientists that are there in this, in the sector. It's not just aerospace or space engineers that exist in the sector. We also have space lawyers. We have space policy makers. We have the space medicine sector. We have whatever sector you call, you can still name it in space. So it's like you have almost all other disciplines within the sector because it's about life we're talking about. It's about life outside of Earth. So when you're referring all of that, then you need almost all expertise that you are applying back here on Earth.
So when anyone says space or mentions anything that has to do with space, it means it's technically outside the Earth we humans live in, right?
Yes, but no, because though we, for example, we would say the Earth is, outside of Earth is space, but Earth is also part of space eventually because Earth is a planet, right? So if we're talking about planetary science, then we would also consider Earth as one of the elements, and that could be usually referred as geosciences or even the sciences that are being done from satellites outside of the Earth's atmosphere to Earth is still space science. But if you're talking in a very academic slang, when you say space science, it basically would mean something beyond Earth. It would just start like that. And if you're talking about something out of your solar system, then it would be astronomy. Then if you're talking about like the interaction Earth has with sun and all of that in between, then it would be space weather, for example. Anyway, so if you say space, it basically would mean something in space. But if you're too technical or not, then it can still be part of space, but not necessarily because you're trying to, put yourself out of the box that you're studying sometimes. But regardless, if you're talking about like celestial objects, then Earth could be also one of it. Because when you talk about stars, we usually forget the sun because the sun is also a star, right? if we're talking about Earth, then planetary science can also be included in Earth because, for example, lots of explorations and other exploration missions that are being done on Mars are usually simulated on Earth with lots of things. And in fact, if I would like to mention, there's actually this new project called Proudly Human that I recently heard of when I was in South Africa recently for our conference. So the basic concept, I don't want to, trim words out of what the whole organization's plan is, but it basically refers Earth as a spaceship, and we can be an astronaut or, those big time space people here on Earth by making Earth a better place. So even a global perspective can't explain this because we were talking about space. So if you take a universal perspective, for example, then you'd consider Earth as part of space. Technically speaking, sometimes it can be something out of the Earth's atmosphere.
I know you mentioned while you were talking that if everywhere around Earth or the Earth is space, then it means, Earth technically is a part of space. Why is space science and technology important to we humans? Is it just because we are a part or a component of what makes up space? And how does it exactly impact our daily lives? How does it affect us?
Well, for example, let's say you wake up someday in the week and you find yourself in a room, and the first thing you would do is basically see what's around you. And once you figured that out, you'd go to your next room and you'd basically discover what's around you. That's the basic element of a human being, which is curiosity. So that's where something starts. But in addition to that, let's say this human being didn't have curiosity. But even though, then a human would still have its needs. So people would start searching first what is around them that could satisfy their needs. So basically the whole idea of, space exploration would be under that in my perspective. But regardless, all of the science, all of the technology, all of the innovation is also under what we basically consider as civilization. So if we would, if we want to have better technologies, better than yesterday, then we would have to, invest our time and energy into understanding what we have at hand and how we can enhance it. Then that is the science, and the betterment of that, environment or the thing that we get to develop through the process of that is called the innovation. Then eventually that's where the technology pops up.
Now, if we consider things like agriculture, things like transportation, moving from one place to another, space science and technology, what role does it have to play in my daily life, for example, in transporting myself from one place to another, or moving around, and other things that have to do with my own personal daily life?
Okay, so that's everyone could understand it. I would simply give, for example, most people would be aware of what the 17 sustainable development goals are, for example, right? So that's like no poverty, no hunger, better, cities and sustainable economies, reduced inequalities, all of those strategic goals that are set by the UN that could basically benefit the whole planet can be satisfied with Earth observation technologies. Just by that, out of 17, then 13 of these SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals can be tackled. So what I mean by that is to advance our agriculture, then the new industrial revolution is based on data. And for data, most of these observational data are gained from satellite imageries. So it basically boils down to space. If we want to have better medical services, let's say, then telemedicine is one solution out of many others. And telemedicine actually came through the developments and research that are being done of space science, because they didn't had ways of sending in doctors into space, but they had the idea of using telemedicine by then. For example, when you drove to your office today, you probably used the GPS to see which route is uncongested. And the fact that you use the GPS basically underlines the fact that you're still using space technologies. The cable, news that you get to see, maybe not the cable news, but even the cable news, it basically has an initial provider that comes from a satellite, but even the satellite dishes that people, install in their households comes from space technologies. And I don't know, it's almost everywhere. The X-rays that we get to do, they were innovated because of space. Lots of technologies, they're either developed as a technology that was supposed to be implemented for space, or is being still implemented in space, or at least those technologies have benefited an early application.
Okay, now all of these innovations that we have mentioned, it really feels like Africa has been left behind in the area of space science and technology. Is it just how it is being portrayed, or is it really what it is?
So I would say there are many factors to this. The first one is how this technology actually evolved. I would say especially all the sending out satellites, all the space exploration, all of that sort of started with the space race, which happened during the Cold War eras, where Russia and the US have been competing of who gets to send people to space. Because when Yuri Gagarin went to space initially, it was basically a missile in which the warhead was changed by a payload that could carry a human being, because the rocket principles are basically the same initially, right? So it was pretty much something that, gave an ow moment to the whole world, the fact that people can now send people to space. And the way it was, constructed was as if it was something that could only be done by superpowers of the world, or, the strong economies of the world. But eventually, right now, to the level that we're using it, it is a necessity, not, a luxurious or some, fancy thing to do, because it has lots and lots of applications that we are already using in our daily lives, like how I have mentioned earlier. So the first reason I would say is because of the human capital. That's a very key element. The fact that we don't get to incorporate them in our curriculums starting from a young age inhibits people from aspiring to join the sector. Because, for example, I could give you myself as an example, and I've been asked lots of times, what do you want to be when you grow up, when I was a kid? And the usual answers would be, being a doctor, being an engineer, being a pilot, because, flying an airplane is, something you would brag, for example, when I was a kid. And I mean, still the case, I would honestly say. But regardless, this gets to happen when the people that ask you the questions would have the exposure. If I said I want to be an astronaut back then most of the people who asked me might not even know what I meant by saying I want to be an astronaut, because there's literally like low to zero exposure of what space means and what sort of benefits that they would get out of it, even though we've been using it for a very long time, regardless. So the first element is the human capital, I would say. And the second thing is the fact that we've been consumers for a very long time. We've been used to it, right? So many African countries, for example, are using their telecom infrastructure is based on geostationary communication satellites, for example. And they've been buying these satellites, or they've been buying these services from other countries, from other non-African countries. Then they've been, so used to it. The infrastructure building cost for them is so expensive, given all their other, in quotation, priorities and, other needs and all of their other debts. And, all of that would inhibit them, or like blind them from seeing that it is actually a sustainable way of developing a country's economy. So there is a very, very low human capital. Even for those who aspire and, grow to be an aerospace engineer, let's say, they basically wouldn't have, a place to work when they come back to their home country or their community. So they would get brain drained in other, other companies that they're working either in Europe or in Japan or in Russia or in the US or whatever. So in other space faring countries, I would say. So, we have a very low human space, organic human capital in regards to space workforce. And the other thing is governments are very used to being a consumer instead of a provider. So that, gives them a very comfortable space that they don't want to change. I think these are the basic two things that are inhibiting Africa for being left behind so much in the space. Though I would like to add a final point on this, as it has not been the case since past few years, though. There are lots of recent developments that there is a mind shift in all of these aspects. So there is a little bit of a movement within governments, within the private sectors for, companies, as in like, private companies or space agencies trying to involve themselves a little bit more from staying as a consumer than growing to be a provider or supplier.
Do you think we can catch up in this area of space science and technology, say maybe in a decade or in 2 decades?
So, it basically starts with this mentality, I would say. If we're planning to catch up, then we'll never catch up, because by the time that we're planning to get there where other spacefaring countries are, then it's not like they would be waiting for us, right there. They're still, doing their technological advancements and all of that. So it's always some parties leading and us following. So unless we get to be trend makers, then we will never catch up. And for that, it's all about changing the narratives, I would say. Having that indigenous space workforce, I'd start with that. And once you have that, having an enabling environment, that means the private sector should open up into this. The investors should be willing and understand that space is actually a really good return investment place that they can invest their money in a very inflating economy. And on top of that, also the government playing its role in having proper taxation systems and encouraging customs regulations and all of that regulatory, procedures and laws that they need to make within the country. And on top of that, collaboration is also a very key element. And Africa is not a region that you would doubt for resources. It's very rich in regards to that. World's smartphones come from elements that are being taken out from Africa. It's just, pretty obvious like that. So we basically don't have issues in resources, but our issue as a continent would be cooperation. And for that, for example, recent agreements like the African Continental Free Trade Agreement would be a key game changer, I would say. And it would enable if existing, the countries that are, having small endeavors, small moves that are trying to make some basic, but at least mandatory moves in regards to joining the space sector or making themselves a spacefaring nation would facilitate in a regional collaboration. So first off, it's not something that you can do alone, because there's pretty much limitations. Even though you'd have, let's say, if a country has all the resources, then they might not have the right, like, let's say, the launch location. If they had the right launch location, they might not have the skill sets or the finance or something. So there will always be this missing element. And it's always good to go out and get some help, especially where you can have a mutual benefit out of.
Now, it's clear that space science and technology helps in this day and time to solve a lot of development issues and challenges, but we have just little finance and funding, and we're trying to put it into other areas like, reducing poverty and other things. What areas would you consider the most important to invest in when it comes to the use of space science and technology, especially in solving very important development challenges on the continent? And why would you say these areas are most important?
Honestly speaking, I don't think I can give like a ranking on what the priorities are, because let's say a person is hungry, then if he's very hungry and you'd like to send him food, then sometimes if there's no like road to his place, for example, you might need to build that as well. But you'd obviously need to find a temporal solution for that. So what I'm trying to say is, ending hunger could be on top of the list, but at the same time, the only way you can end hunger is when you have proper infrastructure, right? It's when you have stable economy, when you have the well-being of the people. Because if all the farmers get to be sick with one contagious virus or something, then all of this is at stake or is lost already. So I honestly don't think there is one thing that you'd say this is the highest priority, but they would all, fit into the pie where you would make the greater good out of. So, but if you'd ask me what are those key segments in making that pie. I would say the first one is people need to eat. So whatever things that you're doing to improve your agriculture, to improve your production is commendable. And another thing is you need to have infrastructure. So I'm telling you these, for example, with a way saying the very basic needs of a human would be a clothing, a place to stay, and food, right? Coming from a space perspective, I wouldn't say this is a way to apply space technologies to get you a fabric, but I would say we can use the application of space and all of that to get you the proper finance so you can afford one. So is under the having a roof over your head, and ending poverty and ending hunger can be under the making your agriculture better, because 60% of world's arable land is in Africa. So it's like, if we get to tackle that, then we can literally feed the world. But yeah, so then agriculture, then the infrastructure industries, the infrastructure and like the building of industries, which actually in another direction also facilitates the agriculture again, because you need lots of technological support in regards to that, so that you wouldn't do it in a very traditional way. But yeah, so infrastructure, industries, agriculture, and also well-being. So
Okay.
I think these three key elements would make Africa a better place, or the whole world a better place, if we use it through space.
Okay, interesting. How much of these efforts intentionally needs to go into the awareness in the area of space education on the continent? How exactly do we intentionally grow the awareness on space in the continent?
All right. So, for example, just like how the Inspiration 4 mission had an orbit around the Earth, and streamed their stay on Netflix and did all of that inspiration. For example, even the very famous Star Trek movie, William Shatner, he was on board. He was on board on the Blue Origin NS-18 flight, if not mistaken, and he got to see what he was dreaming. For example, all of those inspiring things that he left to the generation that we are, to us as a generation, was the time that he got to live it, in fact. And they are doing it intentionally. And the whole idea of these all missions is to make human as a species interplanetary, and this is how we're starting. Even with the principle of sending a rocket to the moon on Mars, the first thing you'd need to is get out of the Earth's atmosphere, and the second thing you do is orbit the Earth, and from a transfer orbit, then you jump to another orbit. So we're basically taking the lessons step by step and making humankind interplanetary. So it is intentional. All of these, call them billionaires or futuristic people or whatever name you want to give them, they're whatever they're doing, they're also contributing to the goal of making humankind interplanetary. There might be different reasons, like it might be from a perspective where Earth might not survive, then we need to go, or it might be from the out of curiosity sort of mentality that we need to go and start to find our ways to live in some other planet, or live in space in general, or try to go out of our solar system. But regardless, you need to further your technological level. You need like major leaps to attain that. Yeah. So what they're basically doing is paying it forward. By then they had the Apollo mission, they had the Star Trek movies and all of other, alien related movies and like films and all of those. And now they're making movies out of the actual realities that are going on. And we've had, I don't know, I can't call figures right now because I can't be accurate, but we had some amount of astronauts since Yuri Gagarin, but we had the most of people going to space in the past few years than ever. And this is enabled because of technologies that Virgin Orbit, Blue Origin, and SpaceX are bringing in, right? So they're all, regardless, they're all contributing to in making humankind interplanetary. And for that, for people to aspire in being that, the initial or the basic thing that you can do is to make people envision that in their future. So for those you can, you'd take them and you'd make them see, you'd make them get the overview effect. But even if not, then at least you'd get to show them through the window of your television so that they would understand what it really means. Then they would, put in their head that they can be, at least once upon a time in the future, that they also can be an astronaut. They can be a space traveler.
So if in 1 minute, as your closing statement, want to relay how important space science and technology is to Africa and how important it is for the future of Africa, how would you say that?
In 1 minute, one of the few things that I'd like to say is space science, space technology, space in general is not just about satellites. Satellites and launching things is where it starts. But we need to make sure that the reasons that we're sending satellites is getting to the end users. If we're talking about farming, then we need to make sure that the data and statistics that we are getting is reaching the farmers, I would say. So it's a very enormous value chain because, as I've mentioned, space, has its legs inside lots and lots of sectors. Its breadth is very wide, and there's an enormous amount of value chain. And if every African country could engage in one of the value chains that makes the whole sector able, then it's one way of turning the economic wheel of their country eventually. And again, we also need to leapfrog technologies. We need to make the leaps so that we can get to be the trend creators, and we need to stop reinventing the wheel. So once some country gets to send a CubeSat, a 1-unit CubeSat, the fact that another African country gets to send that CubeSat doesn't make that country spacefaring. The basic question is, how is that country making its space program sustainable? And how is the society reaping the benefits of space through the technologies either the government or the country is making?
Yeah, that's a good way to close. And I know you mentioned the AfCFTA while we were talking earlier. Does the AfCFTA, in any of its provisions, accommodate a united front in exploration or space science and technology on the continent?
Maybe not directly. I'm not an expert. I haven't read the whole documentation around it and what the agreement constitutes. But as long as trade is involved, then you can make the African Continental Free Trade Agreement a player in your communications. So it can be like moving or all the transportation that's needed amongst African countries. It can be supporting with a finance. So as long as there's a revenue generation in the conversation, then it is trade. Then if there is trade, then you can also make it a major player. So maybe, the trade agreement is pretty vague, and it's basically an enabler. And I honestly don't think it has that specific element of, joint space exploration, supporting schemes and all of that. But as it's a very generic, vague, sort of lines of agreement where the countries get to come to a common point, then they can leverage the trade agreements into their wills. It is possible, but it might not be mentioned specifically, and you don't necessarily need to specify it. As long as there's the will between the countries, then it is possible.
We hope that we don't get buried the barrage of issues, that we forget how important this part of our life is, how important this is to other parts of our life too. Thank you very much for the time and for the insights shared here.
Thank you for inviting me, and I really enjoyed the talk today with you.
Thanks for listening, and don't forget to catch up on all the live shows right here on AfricaTechRadio.com.